Great light to all, and to all a great light. Going to be reading A Man of Passion and Destiny, David. Chapter 1. God's heart, God's man, God's ways. On the surface, excuse me, on the surface, there seemed to be nothing about David that would have impressed God. Nothing caused him to say, "Wow, that's my man." David didn't look much different from any of the other Jewish boys his age. Samuel simply said he was ready, with beautiful eyes and a handsome appearance. That's the only physical description we have of young David. So we know he was handsome, had beautiful eyes, and had a healthy complexion. He may have had red hair, or more likely, he was reddened or bronzed from the hours he spent out in the sun and the wind. David's outward appearance didn't seem to set him apart in any way. He was nothing more than a shepherd, and a very young one at that, living in a little village of Bethlehem. Yet God said, in effect, "You have what I'm looking for, young man. You are the future king of Israel." If we had been living in the farmhouse next door to David's family on the Judean hillside, we might not even have known the name of Jesse's youngest son. After all, his own father didn't even think of including him until Samuel asked, "Are these all your sons?" Then Jesse rubbed his beard and said, "Oh, yeah, there's my youngest. I almost forgot about him. He's out in the field tending the sheep." "Go and fetch him," Samuel said. And suddenly, this young nobody, a boy even his own father forgot about, became somebody. But before we get to David, the king of Israel, we need to go back about 40 years and get to a sense of background and history so we can appreciate the world in which he lived. Chief Frederick Owen. In this book, Abraham to the Middle East Crisis describes those ancient times perfectly in one sentence. The people were on a long drift from God. That was the world into which David was born. Eli, Eli, the high priest, and his wicked sons were gone. His God chosen successor, Samuel, the last of the judges, was an old man. The people had heard all the stories about the days when Israel was a great nation and about the years when Samuel was at the zenith of his career, when he subdued the Philistines and judged the land wisely and well, but most of them knew nothing of that personally. They knew only that Samuel was an aged man and that he had appointed his sons to judge Israel. And what a mistake that was. Look at what the Bible says about them. And it came about when Samuel was old that he appointed his sons judges over Israel. His sons, however, did not walk in his ways, but turned aside after dishonest gain and took bribes and perverted justice. 1 Samuel 8, 1 through 3. So the people were disillusioned and they wanted something done about it. What they really wanted was a king. Actually, Samuel's wayward sons weren't the only reason for their demand. The elders of Israel held a summit meeting at Ramah, a place in the hill country about 5 miles north of Jerusalem. And they said, "Samuel, there are 3 reasons we want a king. First, you are old. Second, your sons don't walk in your ways. And third, we want to be like the other nations. So appoint a king to judge us like all the nations." 1 Sam 8:5. People have always wanted to be like everybody else, to do the popular thing, and these folks were no exception. "We're tired of worshiping an invisible God," everybody says. "Where's your king?" And we have to say, "Oh, he's in heaven." We want a leader here on earth, Samuel. We want to be like all the other nations. Look at the Philistines and the Moabites and the Jebusites and all the other nations. They've all got kings. We want to be like all of them. They didn't say, we want to wait on God to provide what we need. This broke Samuel's heart, so he went to God in prayer about it. And the Lord said to Samuel, listen to the voice of the people in regard to all that, excuse me, listen to the voice of the people in regard to all that they say to you, for they have not rejected you, they have rejected me from being king over them. Now then, listen to their voice. However, you shall solemnly warn them and tell them of the produce of the king who will reign over them. 1 Samuel 8, 7 through 8. So God let them have exactly what they wanted. Did he ever? The man they chose, Saul, was tall, dark, and handsome. That's how people chose kings. They go for someone who looks good. Wow, he'll be a good image for Israel. Saul's our guy. So Saul came on the scene and swept them off their feet. He had a measure of humility to begin with, and he seemed able to rally people around a cause. He had enough moxie to get an army together, and before long, the Israelites thought he's the man for the job. But guess what? Even though Saul was 40 years old when he started to rule, before long he became thin-skinned, hot-tempered, and given to season of depression, even thoughts of murder. So much for the man who was the people's choice. David was born about 10 years after Saul became king. Talk about being born into volatile times. The people of Israel were on a long drift from God, and now to make matters worse, they were becoming disillusioned with the leader they had chosen. But what do you do when your king doesn't walk with God? What do you do when you've gotten your own way and it's all wrong? It's the most disillusioning, insecure feeling in the world, yet you can't put your finger on what's wrong. But graciously, God does not abandon his people, though Samuel, he intervenes. Through Samuel, he intervenes. David, the Lord's choice. And Samuel said to Saul, you have acted foolishly. You have not kept the commandment of the Lord your God, which he commanded you. For now the Lord will have established your kingdom over Israel. But now your kingdom shall not endure. The Lord has sought out for himself a man after his own heart, and the Lord has appointed him as ruler over his people, because you have not kept that the Lord commanded you. 1 Samuel 13, 13 through 14. Say emphasis added. Look at the little 3-letter word in verse 14, man. God has sought out a man, only a man, but what a man he was. Would it surprise you to learn that more has been written about David than about any other biblical character? Abraham has some 14 chapters dedicated to his life, and so does Joseph. Jacob has 11, Elijah has 10, but do you have any idea how many are dedicated to David? 66. If my counting is correct, and that does not include some 59 references to his life in the New Testament. When you realize how much is said about David in the scripture, coupled with the fact that on 2 occasions he is specifically called a man after God's own heart, you could get the feeling that he was some sort of super phenomenal person, some superhero. But I don't want you to get the wrong idea about why God chose David, or why he chose anyone for that matter. So before we begin to look at the fascinating life of this man, we need to set the record straight. Why does God choose people? Or perhaps the question should be, what kind of people does God choose and use? To determine that, we need to look first at a New Testament passage in 1 Corinthians 1. The context here has to do with the way different people viewed the Apostle Paul. Some readers of Paul's letters were Jewish, and they were looking for a miracle, for a sign that proved this man was of God. Some of his readers were Greeks, and they were looking only at surface impressions. One's inner life meant little to them. The Greeks of that day were influenced by brains, brawn, and or beauty. In light of this, then Paul's whole thrust, right? In the first chapter of his first letter to the believers at Corinth was I'm not coming to you with brilliance or human wisdom, and I'm certainly not coming to you with any kind of impressionable physique. Instead, I'm coming in the power of God, and there's good reason for that. Note carefully how Paul put it. For considering your calling, brethren, that there were not many wise according to the flesh, not many mighty, not many noble, but God has chosen the foolish things of the world to shame the wise. God has chosen the weak things of the world to shame the things which are strong, and the base things of the world and the despised. God has chosen the things that are not, that he might nullify the things that are, that no man should boast before God. First Corinthians, perfect. First Corinthians 1:26 through 29. That's perfect right there. I especially like the way the New Berkeley version translate the last two verses of that passage. God also chosen the world's insignificant and despised people and nobodies in order to bring to nothing those who amount to something, so that nobody may boast in the presence of God. VV 28 through 29. Paul says, look around, Corinthians. You won't find many impressive people here. Why? So that no one can boast before God. That's a principle we tend to forget because many of us are still a lot like the Greeks. When we look for people to admire, when we choose our role models, our heroes, we are often swayed or impressed by things that are cause for boasting. We want the beautiful people, the brilliant people, the successful people. We want the best and the brightest. We are terribly enamored of the surface. The superficial impress us much more than we'd like to admit. We even elect a president because he looks good on television. But God says, that's not the way. I make my choices. I choose the nobodies and turn them into somebodies. And that, in a nutshell, is the story of the life of David. Three priorities for God appointed servant leaders. When God scans the earth for potential leaders, he is not on a search for angels in the flesh. He is certainly not looking for perfect people, since there are none. He is searching for men and women like you and me, mere people made up of flesh, but he is also looking for certain qualities in these people and those people, the same qualities he found in David. The first quality God saw in David was spirituality. The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart. What does it mean to be a person after God's own heart? Seems to me it means that you are a person whose life is in harmony with the Lord. What is important to him is important to you. What burdens him burdens you. When he says go to the right, you go to the right. When he says stop that in your life, you stop it. When he says this is wrong and I want you to change, you come to terms with it because you have a heart for God. That's bottom line biblical Christianity. When you are deeply spiritual, you have a heart that is sensitive to the things of God. A parallel verse in Second Chronicles confirms this. For the eyes of the Lord move to and fro throughout the earth, that he may strongly support those whose heart is completely his. Second Chronicles 16:9, emphasis added. What is God looking for? He is looking for men and women whose hearts is completely his, completely. That means they are not locked closets, locked closet. There are no locked closets, right? Let me say it again. Yeah. That means there are no locked closets. Nothing's been swept under the rug. That means that when you do wrong, you admit it and immediately come to terms with it. You're grieved over wrong. You're concerned about those things that displease him. You long to please him in your actions. You care about the motivations behind your actions. That's true spirituality. And that's the first quality David had. The second quality God saw in David was humility. Now the Lord said to Samuel, how long will you grieve over Saul, since I have rejected him from being king over Israel? Fill your horn with oil and go. I will send you to Jesse, the Bethlehemite, for the Bethlehemite, for I have selected a king for myself among his sons. 1 Samuel 16:1. The Lord has gone to the home of Jesse in spirit form. Jesse didn't know God was there. Nobody did. God was on a secret surveillance mission in that home, and he spotted Jesse's youngest son and said, in effect, "That's my man." Why? Because the Lord saw in David a heart that was completely his. The boy was faithfully keeping his father's sheep. God saw humility. He saw a servant's heart. If you want further confirmation of this, go to the Psalms. He also chose David, his servant, and took him from the sheepfolds. Psalm 78:70. I found David, my servant, with my holy oil. I have anointed him. Psalms 89:20. It is as if God says, I don't care about all that slick public image business. Show me a person who has the character, and I'll give him all the image he needs. I don't require some certain temperament. I don't care if he has a lot of charisma. I don't care about size. I don't care about an impressive track record. I care about character. First, is the person deeply authentic in his or her spiritual walk, or is he faking it? And second, is he or she a servant? When you have a servant's heart, you're humble. You do as you're told. You don't rebel. You respect those in charge. You serve faithfully and quietly. That's David. God looked at David out in the fields and the foothills surrounding Bethlehem, keeping his father's sheep faithfully, doing his father's bidding, and God passed his approval on the lad. It should also be noted that a servant doesn't care who gets the glory. Remember that. A servant has one great goal, and that is to make the person he serves look better, to make that person even more successful. A servant does not want the person he serves to fail. A servant doesn't care who gets the glory, just so the job gets done. So while David's brothers were off in the army making rank and fighting big, impressive battles, David was all alone, keeping the sheep. He possessed a servant's heart. The third quality David had was integrity. From the care of the ewes with suckling lambs, he brought him to shepherd Jacob, his people, and Israel, his inheritance. So he shepherded them according to the integrity of his heart and guided them with his skillful hands. Psalms 78:71-72. Circle the wrong integrity. That is so significant. God is not looking for magnificent specimens of humanity. He's looking for deeply spiritual, genuinely humble, honest to the core servants who have integrity. Listen to some of the synonyms for this Hebrew word, daman, translated integrity, complete, whole, innocent, having simplicity of life, wholesome, sound, unimpaired. Isn't that beautiful? Integrity is what you is what you are when nobody's looking. It means being bone deep honest. Today, we live in a world that says in many ways, if you just make a good impression, that's all that matters. But you would never be a man or a woman of God if that's your philosophy. Never. You cannot fake it with the Almighty. He is not impressed with externals. He always focused on the inward qualities, those things that take time and discipline to cultivate. God's method of training his servants. In this regard, it is enlightening to look at how God trained David for a leadership role. His training ground was lonely, obscure, monotonous, and real. Let him describe each of these four disciplines. First, God trained David in solitude. He needed to learn life's major lessons all alone before he could be trusted with responsibility and rewards before the public, as the late biographer F.B. Myers writes. But nature was in his nurse, his compassion, his teacher. Bethlehem is situated 6 miles to the south of Jerusalem by the main road leading to Hebron. Its site is 2,000 feet above the level of the Mediterranean on the northeast slope of a long gray ridge with a deep valley on either side. These unite at some little distance to the east and run down toward the Dead Sea. On the gentle slopes of the hills is fig. On the gentle slopes of the hills, the fig, olive, and vine grow luxuriantly. And in the valleys are the rich cornfields where Ruth once gleaned, and which gave the place its name, the house of bread. The moorlands around Bethlehem, forming the greater part of the Judean plateau, do not, however, present features of soft beauty, but are wild, gaunt, strong, character breeding, Their shepherds have always led and watched their flocks, and their David first embed that knowledge of natural scenery and of pastoral pursuits which colored all his afterlife in poetry, as the contents of the vat the dyer's hand. Such were the schools and schoolmasters of his youth. Solitude has nurturing qualities all its own. Anyone who must have superficial sounds to survive lacks depth. If you can't stand to be alone with yourself, you have deep, unresolved conflicts in your inner life. Solitude has a way of helping us address those issues. When was the last time you got all alone with nature and soaked it in, so alone that the sound of silence seemed deafening? That's where David lived. That's where he first learned to king it. For many nights, he sat alone under the stars. He felt the blustery winds of autumn and the cold rains of winter. He learned to endure the burning rays of summer sun. Solitude was one of the teachers God used. He trained young David for the throne. Second, David grew up in obscurity. That's another way God trains his best personnel in obscurity. Men and women of God, servant leaders in the making, are first unknown, unseen, unappreciated, and unapplauded. In the relentless demand of obscurity, character is built. Strange as it may seem, those who first accept the silence of obscurity are best qualified to handle the applause of popularity. Which leads us to the third training ground, monotony. Monotony. That's being faithful in the menial, insignificant, routine, regular, unexciting, uneventful, daily task of life. Life without a break, without the wine and roses, just dull, plain LIFE. Actually, it's a lot like flying. I have a friend who's been a commercial pilot for over 30 years. He says flying is nothing more than hours and hours of monotony, punctuated by a few seconds of sheer panic. That describes one of God's favorite methods of training, although perhaps without the panic, just the constant, unchanging, endless hours of tired monotony as you learn to be a man or woman of God. Man, this this reminds me of how I talk. Really. With nobody else around, when nobody else notices, when nobody else even cares, that's how we learn to king it. That brings us to the fourth training ground, reality. Up until now, you might have the feeling that despite the solitude, obscurity, and monotony, David was just sitting out on some hilltop in a mystic haze, composing a great piece of music or relaxing in the pastures of Judea and having a great time training those sheep to sit on their hind legs. That's not true. Think ahead with me to 1 Samuel 17. Here is David standing by Saul as a giant lumbers across the distant landscape. Remember Saul, great big tall guy, scared to death, knees knocking inside his tent, hiding from Goliath. And here's little David saying, "Hey, let's go whip the giant." Saul says, "Who are you?" "I'm David." Saul says, "Where have you been?" "I'm living this little. I've been with my father's sheep." And Saul says, "You can't fight the Philistines. You're just a kid." And David responds without hesitation, "Your servant was tending his father's sheep." That's solitude, obscurity, and monotony. When a lion or a bear came and took a lamb from the flock, that's reality. I went out after him and attacked him and rescued it from his mouth. And when he rose up against me, I seized him by his beard and struck him and killed him. 1 Samuel 17, 34 through 35. Where did David get such courage? He had learned it all along before God. What kind of man is this David? He's a man of reality. He's a man who remained responsible when nobody was looking. So this guy, Goliath, says, "David, I'm not worried about him." And you know what happens after that. I can hardly wait to get to that chapter It's one of my favorites. Goliath, Goliath was no big deal. Why? Because David had been killing lions and bears while nobody was around. He'd been facing reality long before he squared off against Goliath. Somehow, we've gotten the idea that getting along with God is unrealistic, that it's not the real world. But getting along with God doesn't mean you sit in some closet and think about infinity. No, it means you get alone and discover how to be more responsible and diligent in all the areas of your life, whether that means fighting lions or bears or simply following orders. That's why I have a problem with the kind of deeper life teaching that says you stand back and God does everything for you. I'll be honest with you. I've never had God fix a flat tire for me, or change a baby's diaper, or confront some giant in my life. Neither did David. He rolled up his sleeves and he fought for those sheep. It was in such scene of reality that David learned to king it. A couple of lasting lessons. David may have lived many centuries ago, but the things we can learn from him are as current as the morning sunrise to stand out in my mind as we draw this chapter to a close. First, it is first, it's in the little things and in the lonely places that we prove ourselves capable of the big things. If you want to be a person with a large vision, you must cultivate the habit of doing the little things well. That's when God puts iron in your bones. The way you fill out those detailed reports, the way you take care of those daily assignments, the way you complete tasks of home or dormitory or work or school is just a reflection of whether you personally are learning to king it. The test of my calling is not how well I do before the public on Sunday, it's how carefully I cover the bases Monday through Saturday when there's nobody to check up on me when nobody is looking. Second, when God develops our inner qualities, he's never in a hurry. Alan Redpath, the late pastor of Moody Memorial Church, put it this way: the conversation of a soul is the miracle of a moment. The manufacture of a saint is the task of a lifetime. When God develops character, he works on it throughout a lifetime. He's never in a hurry. It is in the schoolroom of solitude and obscurity that we learn to become men and women of God. It is from the schoolmasters of monotony and reality that we learn to king it. That's how we become like David, men and women after God's own heart. Amen. Great light, y'all. I'm gonna just end this right here, and I might just come back because I just wanted to just have a book read thing on here. But next time I read, it's gonna be chapter 2. Nobody noticed. That'll be the next chapter I read. The next time I read, A Man of Passion and Destiny, David. I love you all. For ye are Lord in the flesh on earth as it is in heaven.